The blinding flash of light was the last thing Captain Lyra Kane saw before everything shifted. She was back. Again. The blood-soaked battlefield before her was exactly as it had been the first time she'd died here, or the 100th. The charred remains of human tanks and alien walkers lay scattered across a cratered plain. Overhead, the sky burned red with firestorms as enemy ships rained hell down on Earth's forces. Lyra ducked instinctively, avoiding a beam of plasma that streaked past her head, vaporizing a soldier who hadn't yet learned to dive. She clenched her jaw. She knew what was coming next. A towering insectoid war machine would emerge over the ridge in 30 seconds. In 4 to 5 seconds, it would wipe out the squadron to her right. In 60, her commanding officer, General Voss, would be killed by an explosion that would reduce his bunker to rubble. Unless she stopped it. Move forward. Lyra barked into her comms, sprinting toward the ridge before anyone could question her. Flanking maneuver, now. Incoming walker, northwest quadrant. The soldiers hesitated but obeyed, peeling off in a coordinated advance. They didn't know how she knew. They never did. This was her curse. To fight humanity's war over and over, repeating each day until she found the path to victory. The time-travel device implanted in her spine, a secret weapon humanity barely understood, rewound her consciousness every time she died. It was the ultimate weapon in an unwinnable war against the Zavok, an alien species that had decimated Earth's colonies and now sought to erase humanity itself. She reached the ridge just as the insectoid walker appeared, its massive legs crushing the earth beneath it. Lyra didn't hesitate. She fired her plasma grenade launcher, aiming for the weak joint she'd discovered 3 loops ago. The explosion ripped through the walker's front leg, sending it crashing to the ground. This time, the squadron to her right survived. But the bunker was still doomed. General Voss, evacuate now. Lyra shouted into her comms, even as she sprinted toward the command post. She dodged debris and bodies, her boots slipping on mud and blood. She had 30 seconds to stop the bomb. The bunker came into view, a fortified structure half buried in the ground. Voss was outside, barking orders. He glanced up as Lyra approached, his grizzled face twisting in confusion. Captain Kane? What the hell are you doing here? No time, she yelled, grabbing his arm. You're about to die. We have to move. The ground shook violently. Lyra barely had time to throw Voss to the ground before the explosion tore through the bunker. She shielded him with her body as debris rained down, her ears ringing from the blast. When the dust cleared, Voss pushed himself up, coughing. How did you know? Because I've seen it before, she said, wiping blood from her brow. And I'm not letting it happen again. Hours later, as night fell, the human forces regrouped. Lyra sat in the command tent, watching holograms of the battlefield flicker before her. The Zavok had retreated, for now, but they would strike again. They always did. General Voss approached, his expression unreadable. You saved my life today, Captain. And a lot of others. But I need answers. Lyra met his gaze, knowing what she was about to say could get her court-martialed, or worse. I'm caught in a time loop, sir. Every time I die, I go back to the start of this battle. It's a failsafe built into me by Project Paradox. Voss's eyes narrowed. Paradox? That's a myth. It's real. And I'm the proof. She stood, her fists clenched. I've died more times than I can count, sir. And every loop, we lose this war. The Zavok are smarter, faster, and deadlier than we are. But they are not invincible. I've seen their weaknesses. I just need time to exploit them. Voss stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then we use this loop to its fullest. You lead the charge, Captain. Tell us what to do. The next day, the battle began anew. This time, Lyra had the advantage. She knew the enemy's moves, their traps, their weaknesses. Under her guidance, humanity's forces made gains they never had before. They pushed the Zavok back, inch by inch, through fire and blood. But then it happened. As Lyra and her squad breached a Zavok stronghold, a shimmering portal opened before them. From it stepped a Zavok commander clad in gleaming armor, its insectoid form radiating menace. It carried a weapon unlike any Lyra had seen, a staff pulsating with temporal energy. The commander pointed the staff at her, and time itself seemed to fracture. Lyra's squad froze mid-motion, their faces twisted in fear. The commander spoke, its voice a chilling blend of clicks and hisses. "You are not the only ones who wield time as a weapon, human." Before Lyra could react, the staff unleashed a beam of energy. Pain erupted in her chest, and she fell to her knees. The last thing she saw was the commander's cold, alien eyes. And then everything reset. She gasped, jolting awake in the past once more. But something was wrong. This time, the battlefield was different. The Zavok's positions had shifted. Their tactics had changed. They were learning. Panic clawed at her chest as the realization sank in. The Zavok had their own time travel technology, and they were using it against her. The moment Lyra opened her eyes, she knew the loop had changed. The battlefield was eerily silent. The usual cacophony of explosions and screams was replaced by an oppressive hum that vibrated through the air like a living thing. The Zavok weren't just responding, they were rewriting the battle entirely. "Captain Kane, are you okay?" Lieutenant Torres' voice crackled through her comms. His tone was strained, panicked. "Report, Torres," she barked, scanning her surroundings. The landscape was familiar yet subtly wrong. Trees she remembered being obliterated in earlier loops were intact, but twisted unnaturally. Human soldiers moved with uncertainty, their formations disrupted by Zavok traps that hadn't been there before. "They hit us with something new," Torres replied. "Our recon teams disappeared, and their main forces have shifted. It's like they knew exactly what we were planning." They did know, Lyra thought grimly. They are in the loop now. Her pulse quickened as she pieced it together. The Zavok commander with the temporal staff must have figured out her secret. They weren't just countering her knowledge, they were actively manipulating the timeline alongside her. Every step she took, they would be there, rewriting events in their favor. "Torres, listen carefully," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The Zavok have time travel capabilities. They're adapting to our moves before we even make them." "Time travel?" Torres sounded incredulous, but he didn't argue. "What do? We outthink them," she said. "Reroute all forces to Sector 14. We're taking the fight to them before they can rewrite any more of this battle." Lyra led the charge towards Sector 14, where she suspected the Zavok were concentrating their temporal tech. As her squad advanced, they encountered resistance unlike anything she'd faced before. Zavok soldiers seemed to anticipate every tactic, every ambush, as if they'd already seen the outcome. They weren't just fighting her, they were fighting multiple versions of her. Her squad was pinned down by plasma fire when she spotted something that made her blood run cold. Across the battlefield, through the chaos and smoke, she saw herself. Another Lyra Kane, leading a separate human squad, was locked in combat with a different wave of Zavok forces. The other Lyra's movements mirrored her own, but with subtle differences, hesitations, choices Lyra hadn't yet made. "What the hell?" Torres whispered, his eyes wide as he followed her gaze. "Is that you?" "It's a temporal echo," Lyra said, her voice tight. "The Zavok's interference is fracturing the timeline. We're overlapping." Before she could process further, the other Lyra locked eyes with her, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Then, with brutal efficiency, the other version of her was cut down by a Zavok sniper. Lyra clenched her fists, fighting the nausea that rose in her gut. "Focus. You don't have time to fall apart." She rallied her squad and pressed forward, determined to reach the Zavok temporal hub. It had to be close. The alien traps and defenses grew more intricate, more desperate, the closer they got. By the time they reached the Zavok facility in Sector 14, half of her squad was gone. The survivors were battered and blooded, their once pristine armor scorched and dented. The facility itself was a monolithic structure of black and silver, pulsating with an unnatural glow. Tendrils of energy arced from its core, warping the air around it. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice resolute. "The temporal hub. How do we destroy it?" Torres asked, clutching his plasma rifle like a lifeline. "Not destroy," Lyra corrected. "We take it. If we destroy it, they'll just rebuild. But if we control it, we control the timeline." Her plan was madness, and she knew it. But it was their only shot. The assault on the temporal hub was chaos incarnate. Zavok soldiers poured out of the structure, their weapons blazing with deadly precision. Lyra's squad fought like cornered animals, pushing through the enemy lines inch by bloody inch. Every step felt like a lifetime. Inside the facility, the air crackled with temporal energy. The walls shimmered, showing glimpses of alternate realities, futures where humanity was wiped out, where the Zavok ruled unchallenged. Lyra pushed the images from her mind and focused on the core, a massive, glowing sphere suspended in the center of the chamber. Zavok engineers worked furiously to stabilize it, their chittering voices rising in urgency. "We need to disable their control systems," Lyra shouted. "Cover me!" Torres and the remaining soldiers opened fire, drawing the Zavok's attention as Lyra sprinted toward the core. Her heart pounded as she dodged plasma bolts and leapt over fallen debris. She reached the control console and began frantically interfacing with it, her hands trembling as she navigated alien code. The Zavok didn't make it easy. One of their commanders, a towering, insectoid brute with glowing armor, charged toward her, its staff crackling with energy. Lyra barely had time to grab a fallen soldier's rifle and fire, hitting the commander square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. She turned back to the console, ignoring the chaos around her. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a way to reverse the flow of temporal energy. She input the command and braced herself. The core erupted in a blinding surge of light, and the world twisted violently. When the light faded, Lyra found herself standing in a field of ash. The facility was gone, replaced by a crater. Her squad was nowhere to be seen. She checked her comms. Static. Panic set in. Had she failed? Had the timeline collapsed entirely? Then, she saw them. Zavok soldiers, scattered and disoriented, their weapons sparking uselessly. Whatever she'd done to the core, it had disrupted their temporal control. For now, the timeline was hers. But deep down, she knew the war was far from over. The Zavok wouldn't stop. They'd rebuild their technology. They'd adapt. And so would she. Lyra's vision swam as she staggered across the ashen battlefield. The rupture of the Zavok's temporal hub had destabilized the timeline itself. Fragments of reality flickered around her, brief flashes of lives she might have lived, or futures yet to come. In one, she saw herself leading humanity to victory. In another, she lay dead amidst an endless sea of Zavok corpses. Her comms crackled to life. "Captain Kane? Are you there?" Torres' voice was faint, but it was enough to ground her. "I'm here," she replied, forcing strength into her voice. "Report? We've regrouped, but we've got a new problem. It's worse than anything we've seen before." Torres hesitated, his fear palpable. "It's like the Zavok are rewriting the timeline in real time. They're countering us before we even move." Lyra's stomach sank. She'd suspected as much. Whatever she'd done to the core, it hadn't stopped the Zavok entirely. It had only escalated the temporal arms race. Now, both sides were locked in a battle not just of tactics, but of timelines themselves. She activated her emergency beacon, homing in on Torres' location. When she arrived, she found the survivors huddled in a bombed-out structure, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Torres stood by a portable holodisplay, where a chaotic map of shifting timelines flickered. "What are we looking at?" she asked. "Temporal feedback," Torres said grimly. "The rupture caused by the hub is spreading. Every time we make a move, the Zavok counter it by pulling from alternate timelines. They've created multiple versions of themselves, parallel forces converging on this reality." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "And us?" Torres shook his head. "We don't have the tech to do the same. Our loops are linear. They're running circles around us." The realization hit Lyra like a punch to the gut. The Zavok had turned time into a weapon of infinite potential, and humanity was fighting with a broken blade. The next Zavok assault came within hours. Lyra barely had time to organize a defense before the first wave hit. But this was no ordinary army. The Zavok forces came in layers, each wave subtly different, as if plucked from alternate realities where they'd adapted to every conceivable strategy. Human soldiers fell by the dozens. Defensive lines crumbled under the sheer weight of the enemy's temporal might. Lyra fought like a woman possessed, using every ounce of her hard-earned knowledge to outmaneuver the Zavok. But it wasn't enough. For every victory, the Zavok responded with twice the force. She knew she was running out of options. As she retreated with the remnants of her squad, she felt the familiar pull of despair. This wasn't just a losing battle, it was an unraveling of reality itself. Every death, every defeat, frayed the edges of the timeline further. If something didn't change, there would be nothing left to save. Back at the human forward base, Lyra paced in the command tent, her mind racing. Voss stood nearby, his face pale but resolute. "Captain," he said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "We can't keep fighting like this. If you have any ideas, anything at all, now's the time." Lyra stopped and looked at him, her jaw tightening. "We need to level the playing field. We need our own temporal tech." Voss frowned. "Our scientists barely understand the loops you're caught in. Building something to counter the Zavok? That could take years." "We don't have years," she snapped. "But we don't need to build it from scratch." The core I ruptured, it sent fragments of their tech scattering across the battlefield. If we can recover some of it, we might be able to jury-rig a solution. Voss nodded slowly. "It's a long shot. But it's better than nothing." The recovery mission was a desperate gamble. Lyra led a small team deep into Zavok territory, braving enemy patrols and environmental hazards. The landscape was warped by temporal distortions, trees grew and withered in seconds, rivers flowed backward, and the sky shifted colors like a living kaleidoscope. At the epicenter of the distortion, they found what they were looking for, a fragment of the Zavok temporal core. The shard pulsed with an eerie blue light, crackling with unstable energy. As Lyra reached for it, a voice echoed through the distortion. "You cannot win, human." She spun around, her rifle raised. The Zavok commander from before emerged from the shadows, its temporal staff humming with power. Around it, temporal echoes of itself flickered, forming a chorus of identical commanders from alternate timelines. "You think to wield our power against us," the commander hissed, its alien voice dripping with disdain. "You are but children playing with fire." Lyra didn't hesitate. She fired, but the commander was faster. With a wave of its staff, time fractured around her, freezing her squad in place. She felt the pull of the temporal distortion as it tried to rip her apart, but she gritted her teeth and fought back. Reaching deep into her training, and the instincts honed by countless loops, she grabbed the fragment and slammed it into the ground. The resulting shockwave sent both her and the commander flying. When she opened her eyes, the world had stabilized. The echoes of the commander were gone, and her squad was stirring. "Did it work?" Torres asked, his voice shaky. Lyra looked at the fragment, now fused with her temporal implant. It was unstable, but it hummed with a strange, raw potential. "We're about to find out," she said, her voice grim. "Get ready to rewrite history." The moment Lyra activated the fused temporal implant, reality shuddered. A violent ripple of energy surged outward, distorting the battlefield into a kaleidoscope of overlapping timelines. Time itself buckled, folding in on itself as the past, present, and future collided in a chaotic swirl of light and sound. Her squad stood frozen, their faces twisted in expressions of awe and terror as flickers of their alternate selves bled into view, versions of them alive, dead, victorious, and defeated. Lyra felt the power of the Zavok shard coursing through her veins, an impossible fusion of alien technology and human ingenuity. It was overwhelming, but she gritted her teeth and held on. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was the fulcrum of the timeline. "Captain, what's happening?" Torres shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of temporal energy. "We're taking control," Lyra said, her voice cold with determination. "No more reacting. No more guessing. It's our turn to rewrite the rules." The Zavok responded immediately. Across the battlefield, their forces converged, led by their commander, its temporal staff blazing with energy. Behind it, an army of temporal echoes emerged, each version of the commander a twisted reflection of the original. They moved in perfect synchronization, their combined power warping the very fabric of reality. You dare to challenge the Zavok mastery of time? The commander's voice echoed across the battlefield, layered with the voices of its echoes. You will be erased from existence. Not today, Lyra growled. She raised her hand, and the implant pulsed with energy. The battlefield shifted around her as she manipulated the timeline directly. Zavok soldiers froze mid-charge, their movements rewinding as she unraveled their actions before they could happen. Temporal echoes dissolved into nothingness, their existence erased with a flick of her will. But the Zavok commander was no easy opponent. It countered her moves with terrifying precision, splitting into more echoes that attacked from every angle. For every one she erased, 2 more seemed to take its place. You can't win, the commander sneered. For every moment you change, we create 10 more. You fight against infinity itself. Then I'll burn infinity down, Lyra shot back. The battle escalated into a war of timelines, a chaotic dance of rewrites and counter-rewrites. The sky above them fractured into 1,000 overlapping realities, each one a glimpse of what could be. Lyra saw futures where humanity triumphed and futures where it fell. She saw herself victorious, broken, and everything in between. But she didn't falter. She knew the truth now. The Zavok relied on their temporal dominance to maintain their power, but they weren't invincible. Their strength lay in their arrogance, their belief that no one could challenge their mastery of time. And she was about to prove them wrong. Lyra focused on the shard's connection to the Zavok's temporal core. She could feel it, a tether linking her to their central hub, the anchor point of their entire temporal network. If she could sever it, she could collapse their control over time entirely. But it would come at a cost. Torres, she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. Get everyone out of here. Now. What? No. We're not leaving you. Torres protested. That's an order, she snapped. This ends here. Go. Reluctantly, Torres and the remaining soldiers retreated, leaving Lyra alone to face the Zavok commander and its army of echoes. The final confrontation was a blur of light and motion. Lyra pushed the implant to its limits, wielding time itself as a weapon. She looped back on herself, creating temporal echoes of her own to counter the Zavok forces. Each version of her fought with the same relentless determination, their combined efforts overwhelming the enemy. The Zavok commander faltered, its echoes flickering as Lyra's assault pushed it closer to the edge of collapse. You don't understand what you're doing, it roared. If you destroy the core, you risk unraveling everything. Better than letting you control it, Lyra shot back. With a final surge of energy, she directed all her power toward the tether. The shard in her implant flared brightly, and the tether snapped. The temporal core, deep within Zavok space, imploded in a blinding flash of light, sending shockwaves rippling through the timeline. The battlefield went silent. The echoes vanished, and the overlapping realities stabilized. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, time was linear again. Lyra collapsed to her knees, the shard in her implant reduced to a faint, flickering glow. The Zavok commander lay before her, its body broken and its temporal staff shattered. You think you've won, it rasped, its voice weak. But time is relentless. It will always find a way to undo you. Let it try, Lyra said, her voice a defiant whisper. When Torres and the others returned, they found Lyra standing amidst the ruins of the battlefield, her armor scorched and her face weary but resolute. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, humanity had a fighting chance. As the sun rose over the shattered landscape, Lyra allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. They'd taken the first step. Now, it was time to reclaim their future.